I started working the overnight shift at the AM station in the summer of 1994. The town was small, tucked into the mountains, the kind of place where every road curved twice as much as it needed to, and the air always carried a faint scent of pine and dust. The station sat at the edge of the main street, a low brick building with peeling white paint and a faded sign swinging on rusted chains. Inside, it smelled faintly of old carpet, coffee, and metal. The console was a jumble of switches and dials, reel-to-reel tape decks, and a microphone that never seemed to sit quite level. My job was simple: monitor the equipment, run the music, occasionally announce the weather. Mostly it was quiet, so quiet that even the low hum of the fluorescent lights seemed loud. The first few nights passed uneventfully. I learned the rhythm of the town through the radio. Cars passing sporadically outside, the occasional dog barking somewhere on a distant street, the wind in the pines that rattled a broken window frame just enough to make me check it. I kept the tape decks full and the records spinning. I liked the solitude at first. The night shifts had a clarity to them, a kind of sharp focus. There was a comfort in the predictability of it, the songs, the weather reports, the way the mountains darkened at one end of the valley and caught the first pale light at the other. It was the calls that changed everything. They began late, a week or so into my shift. The phone would ring once, twice, and then I'd answer, only to hear a pause, a breath, and then a soft voice asking me to play it slower. At first, I assumed it was some local kid, bored and testing me. I slowed the tape, adjusted the playback speed. The music warped, the notes stretching into something elongated and unfamiliar. Then I noticed it. Beneath the music, faintly at first, there were voices. Not singing, not yelling, just speaking. Listing things, streets, houses, times. The voices were clipped, deliberate, like someone reading from a list, naming the exact address and time of day for something that had already happened or was about to happen. I checked the tape deck, rewound it, played it again, and the names were the same. Every night, more names, more streets. I compared them to the town map tacked to the wall. Every street mentioned existed. Every house too. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, someone recording neighborhood details and embedding them under music. I even thought about filing the tapes away, keeping them for the authorities. But the calls didn't stop. Every night, voices under the songs, the same request to slow it down. The rhythm of the station changed. I stopped noticing the fluorescent hum and started listening for the voices, for the quiet hints between the records. There was a pattern, a cadence, but it never made sense in a way I could explain. Then the town started evacuating. It wasn't gradual. One night, I drove home after my shift and found the main street empty. Gas masks were stacked in the library foyer. People were carrying small bags, whispering urgently to one another. Notices about a gas leak, highly toxic, a potential disaster, were taped to every door. I tried calling friends, neighbors, but the lines were dead. I spent that night watching the empty streets, headlights sweeping past in the distance, the smell of pine and dust replaced by the acrid tang of fear. The gas leak never existed. Later, I learned it had been a false alarm, a rumor, a miscommunication. By the next week, the town was quiet, as if everyone had vanished. Only the AM station remained, the low hum of the transmitter filling the empty air. With the town gone, the calls stopped. The voices under the music continued, though sometimes so faint I would doubt my own hearing. I kept the station running, though there was no one left to listen. Nights were the same crackle of static, the same repetition of songs, now stretched slower and slower. I stopped adjusting the tapes. I stopped listening for patterns. I left the lights on, kept the console warm with the low heat of the electronics, and waited for the shift to end, though there was no one to hand it off to. The station closed within a year. The equipment was dismantled, the building sold, but even now, more than a decade later, I sometimes catch it. In the car late at night, when the static sweeps across an empty AM band, I hear the faintest traces of those broadcasts. Music slowed, voices naming streets and houses, fragments of that long-ago summer. I have no way to explain it. The frequency is dead, the station gone. I have no recordings. Yet the voices remain, etched into the memory of the valley, as if the mountains themselves remember every name, every address, every moment from that last shift. I never returned to the town. I moved east, took a job that kept me busy, surrounded myself with noise and people. But sometimes, when I drive past a silent stretch of road, I feel the same weight of the empty streets, the same hush that settled over the town in 1994. It is inescapable in its clarity. I know the names, the times, the streets, the houses. They are part of me now, permanent and precise, etched into the nights when I was alone at the console, when the voices under the music spoke only to me. The AM station no longer exists. The building has been torn down. The mountains remain, unchanged and indifferent. Yet in the silence of a late night, when no one is listening and the radio is dead, I can still hear it. The voices never stopped, not really. They were never meant for anyone else. I learned to live with it, the same way the town vanished without a trace. I accept it as part of the place, part of the summer, part of that last shift at the radio station, a memory that is precise, quiet, and permanent. Every detail remains. Every night, I hear it again, the slow music, the voices naming streets, houses, and times as clear and deliberate as the day it first happened. There is no explanation. No one else can hear it. The town evacuated. The station closed. I left. Yet it endures, etched into the quiet, a recording that never existed and a broadcast that never ends. I grew up in a small New England town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where secrets had a way of sliding under the surface, quiet and persistent. The town itself was built on hills and old stone walls, narrow streets that wound toward the river, and a patchwork of clapboard houses that had been painted more times than anyone could remember. The edges of town fell away quickly into woods and fields, and beyond that, the old quarry. The quarry was something you learned about as soon as you could walk, even if no one ever explained it. It was fenced off with rusted chain link, the signs warning no trespassing bent and weathered, almost like no one bothered to check them. Still, every kid who could climb or squeeze under the fence did. Nobody talked about it with adults. It was understood that if you went there, you went quietly and carefully, and you didn't ask questions afterward. The water in the quarry had a color that was impossible to describe exactly. From a distance it looked black, but up close it was a deep green, like algae had settled in layers under the surface, untouched. The surface itself was always perfectly still. Rain fell, rivers swelled elsewhere, but the water at the quarry never rose or fell. People who had lived there longer than I had warned us that it wasn't normal, but no one explained why. Every summer there were stories. Someone drowned, always someone you knew the name of. It didn't happen every year, but often enough that everyone treated the water like a boundary, something to fear even on the hottest days. On the rare occasions when someone went after dark, the town would hold its breath. I never did. I couldn't imagine it. When I was 12, the summer sunlight fell in long, dry rays across the hills, and the air smelled of dust and pine and the faint tang of the river. That summer, my friends and I were daring each other more than usual, climbing the rusted fence, jumping onto the flat rocks above the water, watching it ripple from afar. One evening, as the sun was tipping low and the shadows were long, we heard splashing. It came from somewhere deep in the quarry, the water breaking sharply, randomly, like someone was testing its surface. We froze and listened. It didn't stop. Nobody went closer. Even then, none of us would have admitted how tense it made us. The adults didn't talk about it, but we all knew. The summer stretched on, dry and warm, and then late one afternoon, something happened that I still can't quite make sense of. One of the kids came out of the quarry, who hadn't been reported missing. No one knew his name at first. He emerged from the water and climbed the rocks slowly, deliberately, like someone moving underwater might if they didn't trust their own balance. He didn't speak, and he didn't seem to breathe in the usual way. His eyes barely moved. He didn't blink the way we blink. It was as if he had forgotten to, or that it wasn't necessary. Nobody approached him. We watched from a distance while he made his way out of the quarry and onto the path that led back to town. Someone ran to get a parent, and the police arrived soon after, but even they didn't know what to do with him. He was examined, questioned, and eventually released, but he never said a word about where he had been or how he had gotten there. He didn't speak again for weeks, and when he did, it was only in single words, slow and careful. After that summer, the town changed. Not openly, not dramatically, but quietly. The quarry was filled with concrete the next year, poured in layers over the water until there was nothing left but a flat, gray surface. The fences remained, the weeds around the edges grew, but the water was gone, replaced by a surface that was both permanent and lifeless. The memorials began shortly after. Every year, the town would gather near the site, lay flowers, and remember the kids who had drowned there, though most of us had been too young to understand exactly what had happened. Parents sometimes whispered about responsibility and guilt. about what should have been done, but the town had its own way of dealing with grief. It was quiet and steady, just like the water had been. I returned as an adult, years later, to see the place. The concrete was cracked in spots, weeds sprouting through, and the fence sagged in the middle. It looked almost like a parking lot, or an empty foundation, but I could remember the green-black water, the sound of splashes at night, the way the kid had moved through it without urgency or fear. I stood there for a long time, the sun low in the sky, and I realized that no one had ever explained why the water never changed, why some kids had drowned and others hadn't, why that one boy had emerged when he shouldn't have. It wasn't important anymore, not to the town. What mattered was that we remembered, that the memorials stood, and that we all understood, without words, that some places were never meant to be touched. The memory of the quarry stayed with me in small ways. I would dream of it sometimes, the smell of wet stone and pine and algae, the sudden sound of splashing in the darkness. I never told anyone outside the town about it. It didn't need to be told. Some things are better left as they were, quiet and impenetrable. The memorials reminded us every year of the boundaries we had all learned as children, where to walk, where to stop, and which waters to respect. By the time I left for college, the concrete surface had already begun to wear. People walked over it casually, using it as a shortcut to the other side of the woods, but every so often, when the air was still and the sun was low, I would swear I could hear a splash. The memory of the quarry was embedded too deeply in the rhythm of the town to disappear entirely. Even now, years later, I understand what the town had known all along. There were boundaries, invisible but strict. The water was one. The quarry was one. And the boy who climbed out without blinking taught the rest of us something we couldn't articulate. That some experiences are absolute, undeniable, and unshakable, and that the quiet respect for those boundaries is what keeps a town whole. The memorials remain, the stories linger, and the summer of that boy who emerged from the water stays etched in my memory, clear and precise, like the surface of a pond that never changes. We never returned to the water. We never spoke of the splashes at night. But the lessons of the quarry, the awareness of the risk, and the respect for the unknown, stayed with all of us who had grown up there. The town moved on in its quiet, deliberate way, and I moved with it, carrying the memory of the place, the still green-black water, and the boy who had emerged from it, a living reminder that some boundaries should never be crossed, and some waters should never be touched. I first heard about the lake from an old flyer my uncle had tucked into a drawer. It advertised a cheap cabin for rent in northern Ontario, tucked somewhere between the forests and the patchwork of lakes the maps barely acknowledged. I went with 3 friends that summer in 1974, driven by the kind of reckless confidence only a group of 19-year-olds could muster. The roads narrowed to gravel as we drove deeper into the woods, the car bouncing over potholes that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The last stretch was little more than ruts in the dirt, overhung with low pine branches that scraped the roof of our car. When we finally arrived, the lake was visible through a break in the trees, flat and still, like glass in a frame. I remember thinking it looked unnaturally quiet, but I shrugged it off. The cabin itself was a small, rectangular building with faded green paint and a roof that sagged in the middle. The windows were grimy but intact, and the door closed with a hollow thud. It smelled of old wood and damp earth. It was cheap enough that we didn't question it. From the first day, the lake struck me as odd. We brought fishing gear, expecting at least some small catch, but no matter where we cast, nothing stirred. No fish jumped, no ripples suggested movement beneath the water. It wasn't just that the fish weren't biting. It was that the lake was silent in a way that didn't feel natural. I noticed too that the edges of the water were free of birds. No gulls or crows circled above, no ducks skimmed the surface, no herons waded in the shallows. The grass along the shore was untouched by insects. Normally, in Ontario in July, there's always something buzzing or crawling. Here there was nothing, not even the faint glint of mosquitoes or the soft whine of midges. It was quiet, almost exaggeratedly so. The first night, the lake made a sound that I can't forget. It wasn't wind or water lapping against the shore. It was a low, slow noise like heavy breathing. We didn't speak about it at first. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin, and the moon reflected pale and blurred on the water. The surface rippled gently in a pattern that didn't match the occasional gust of wind. Even when the air was still, the lake shifted, sending soft undulations outward. We set up our campfire near the cabin, but the glow didn't carry far, and the farther we looked, the more the lake seemed to watch silently. During the second day, we noticed old wooden signs half submerged near the shore. They were sun-bleached and rotting, leaning at strange angles. At first, we thought they were about swimming, but the lettering read, "Do not anchor." The wood was cracked, and the paint flaked, but the warning was clear. None of us had ever seen a sign like that, and it felt out of place, as if it had been there for decades, ignored and forgotten. I wondered if the locals had placed it after some long-ago accident. We spent hours trying to understand the lake. We dragged the boat along the water, looking for areas where fish might hide. When we tied the boat to the dock, we secured it carefully, double-knotting the rope. That night, I woke to the sound of water slapping softly against the shore, an odd rhythm that didn't match the wind. In the morning, the boat was not where we left it. The rope had been cut clean through. There were no footprints around the dock, no signs that anyone had approached it. My stomach turned as I thought about the warning signs, the silence, and the emptiness of the lake. As the days went on, the strangeness intensified. The water seemed heavier than normal, almost viscous, though it looked like water. Sometimes, when we leaned over the edge, our hands would sink further than expected, as if the lake swallowed weight more readily than a normal body of water. One afternoon, I saw one of my friends struggle to lift a small crate from the boat. It slipped from his hands and sank immediately, disappearing into a dark patch where the sunlight didn't penetrate. We tried to mark the spot with a stick, but the water was still when we returned an hour later. There was no sign of the crate, no bubble trail, nothing. The nights became unbearable. The soft breathing of the lake was constant, a rhythm that seemed to follow the rise and fall of the moon. Sometimes I swore I felt subtle movements beneath the surface, a shift in the water that suggested something large, unidentifiable, moving just out of sight. Sleep was impossible. We kept a fire going each night, but the shadows it cast only made the lake look more alien, a black mirror with no bottom. By the fourth day, one of my friends refused to go near the water. He sat on the cabin porch, staring at the lake, pale and silent. The others were tense, checking knots, ropes, and lines, but nothing explained what we saw, or didn't see. The boat drifted again one morning. We found it several yards from the dock, still tied with the cut rope. The realization that it had moved without anyone touching it filled me with a slow, creeping dread. Before we left, we tried to talk to the locals. They were hesitant, their gazes dropping to the ground whenever the lake was mentioned. Eventually, one of the older men muttered that the lake takes weight, then shut the conversation with a shrug. That was all the explanation they would give. We didn't push further, because even asking made them uncomfortable. Something about the way they avoided the subject felt like an unspoken rule. I returned home carrying an unease I couldn't shake. Two of my friends have never spoken of that trip since. The third drowned several years later in a public pool. I can't help but remember the way the water swallowed weight at that lake, how objects disappeared with no trace. I think about the boat drifting, the rope cut perfectly, and the silence of the surrounding forest. It was not a place meant for people. Not in the conventional sense, and certainly not for understanding. The lake was empty, alive only in its ability to hold and consume, leaving a void in the mind that no words can fill. Even now, decades later, I can recall the smell of wet wood and pine, the strange quiet, and the way the surface of the water seemed to watch without eyes. I have no explanation for what happened there, no rational account that satisfies the memory. I do know one thing: we were unprepared for the lake, and it reminded us, in ways that still haunt me, that nature sometimes keeps secrets that are best left alone. It was a lesson learned too late, and one that cost more than we understood at the time. My name is Daniel Price. In the summer of 1987, I took a job packing fish in a coastal Oregon town because I needed tuition money, and my uncle knew the foreman. I was 19 and thought hard work would keep my head clear. The town sat low and damp between the ocean and a marshy river mouth. Fog rolled in most mornings and never fully left. It thinned by afternoon, but stayed like a film on everything. Buildings kept their paint for a few years, then it peeled and sagged. The air smelled like salt and diesel, and rot that came from old pilings and dead kelp and something deeper that never aired out. The processing plant was the largest structure in town. It sat back from the docks on concrete pads, a long block of gray walls with vents that breathed cold air. Trucks arrived before dawn, and again near dusk. They came from inland, from rivers and lakes hours away. They backed up to the loading bays and idled while crews unloaded crates of fish packed in ice. I asked once why there were no boats tied up at the docks. The docks existed, but they were empty except for a few pleasure craft and a tug that rarely moved. No one answered the question. They kept working. The locals did not fish anymore. That struck me after the first week. I had grown up around small ports. People talked about tides and gear and runs. Here they talked about shifts and gauges and weight. Men and women worked fast and kept their heads down. Their hands were scarred and numb. They did not smell like the sea. They smelled like bleach and rubber. When the fog thickened, they moved inside and closed doors. The cold storage warehouse sat attached to the plant, a thick-walled box with heavy steel doors and warning lights above each bay. Inside it was quiet in a way that pressed on the ears. The floors were concrete and always wet. The lights hummed. The freezers ran in rows, each with a gauge mounted above the handle. The numbers stayed steady most of the time. When they dipped, the foreman took note and had someone check the seals. There was a locked sub-basement below the cold storage. The stairs down were behind a steel door with a padlock and a sign that said authorized personnel only. No one talked about it. We were told not to go near it. It was not part of our route. Yet sometimes the temperature gauges on the floor above dropped fast, as if a large amount of cold had been pulled into one place. The readings would fall several degrees and then recover over an hour. The foreman wrote it down and moved on. Work ran on a rhythm. We hauled crates, sorted fish, packed them into boxes, sealed and labeled, then moved them into storage. The fish arrived already dead and stiff. Their eyes were dull. Some were damaged. The smell of blood and ice mixed with ammonia from the cleaners. Breaks were short. Lunch happened at long tables in a room with windows painted over. People ate quickly. No one stayed alone. If someone finished early, they waited until another person stood up. It was not a rule, but it happened every day. One man quit mid-shift in my second week. He left his gloves on the table and walked out the bay door without his jacket. I heard later that he claimed he heard knocking from inside the freezer walls. Management said it was thermal expansion. Metal contracts and expands. Pipes pop. Ice shifts. That explanation fit the setting. Still, after that day, people flinched when a freezer kicked on. I started to notice details once my hands learned the work. The town had a small library with a local history shelf. I went there on a Sunday because the fog made the beach feel closed off. Old photos showed boats lined up at the docks, nets drying on racks, men in oilskins smiling for the camera. A plaque listed the names of vessels lost in a storm in the early 1960s. It was a long list for a town this size. No bodies recovered. The fleet vanished in one night when a storm rose fast and pinned them offshore. The town rebuilt. The photos stopped showing boats after that decade. Back at the plant, I noticed that some freezers were never opened during my shifts. Their handles were frosted thick. The gauges above them showed stable numbers, colder than the others by a few degrees. When the gauges dipped suddenly, it was those units that changed first. The foreman avoided them. Inventory lists marked them as reserve. One night, I was assigned inventory. It was late and quiet. The fog pressed against the windows like a hand. I walked the aisles with a clipboard and a flashlight. My breath fogged in front of me. The lights flickered now and then. When I reached the far row, the temperature dropped hard. The gauge needle slid down while I watched. I felt it in my chest. The hum deepened. I shined the flashlight across the doors. Frost coated the steel. On one door, the frost had a pattern that did not match the others. It bulged and stretched, as if something had pressed from the inside and then held. I moved closer. The pattern was not smooth. It had length and uneven edges. I saw shapes that suggested limbs, bent at odd angles, overlapping. Not frozen fish. Too long. Too uneven. The frost had formed around them, thickest at the edges, thinner where pressure had been applied. I felt sick. I did not open the door. I stepped back and wrote nothing on the clipboard. I finished the route and turned in the papers. I did not sleep that night. The sound of the plant carried through the town. A low thrum that never stopped. Over the next days, I watched for signs that I had imagined it. I paid attention to trucks. Some arrived with no markings and left empty. I watched the sub-basement door. Once, early in the morning, I saw men in plain coats unlock it and carry crates down the stairs. The crates were long and narrow. They were not iced fish boxes. They moved carefully, as if the contents were heavy and fragile. The door locked again. I put pieces together slowly, because my mind resisted the idea. The town lost a fleet. No bodies recovered. Cold storage built later. Inland fish processing replaced local fishing. A locked sub-basement. Reserve freezers colder than needed. Knocking in walls explained away. People avoiding being alone. The shapes in the frost. I went back to the library and read old newspapers on microfilm. After the storm, the town faced lawsuits from families. Insurance disputes dragged on. There were claims of improper safety and pressure to fish despite weather. The cases settled quietly. The plant expanded in the following years. A company bought the operation and modernized it. Names changed. Ownership shifted. I realized the cold storage could hold more than fish. Cold preserves. Cold hides. If bodies were recovered later, if nets or tides brought them in damaged and unrecognizable, cold could keep them intact long enough to manage claims. It could delay discovery. It could allow identification to be controlled. It could also hide evidence of cause. Bruises fade. Cuts heal in cold. Time stops. The knocking could be contraction and expansion, or it could be gas release from thaw cycles. Bodies release gases. Freezer walls transmit sound. Shapes pressed into frost could be limbs moved by pressure changes when temperatures dropped. Nothing supernatural. Just physics and decay slowed. I could not prove it. I could not unsee it. The next morning I quit. I said nothing. I packed my car and drove inland until the fog thinned and the air warmed. I felt lighter once the plant was behind me. A week later, the warehouse burned down. I read about it in a local paper I bought at a gas station. The fire started late at night. The cold storage took the worst damage. The sub-basement collapsed. The official cause was an electrical fault. No injuries reported. The company pledged to rebuild. They did within a month. New walls. New freezers. Updated systems. There was no mention of what had been inside when it burned. No investigation beyond routine. The town returned to work. Trucks kept coming from inland. The docks stayed empty. The fog kept its hold. Years later, I learned more through public records. After the fire, several long-standing claims were resolved. Settlements closed. A memorial fund was announced for families of the lost fleet. It cited recovered remains that could not be identified due to fire damage. Closure was offered. The town held a ceremony. Names were read. The plant sponsored it. I understand now how it worked. After the storm, bodies came back over months and years. Some washed ashore. Some tangled in gear. Some caught in nets far from where they went down. The town could not afford another reckoning. Cold storage provided a solution that was wrong and effective. Preserve remains. Control timing. Shape narratives. Reduce liability. Keep people working. The fear at the plant was not of ghosts or monsters. It was of knowing what shared space held and what silence bought. People ate quickly because they did not want to be alone with the sound of the walls. They did not fish because the sea carried consequences they could not manage. They worked processing fish from elsewhere to keep distance. I left and went to college. I did not return. The memory stays because it was real and grounded in choices made under pressure. Cold can keep things intact. Fire can erase. Between them, truth can be managed. I saw the evidence in frost and gauges and behavior. The ending was not vague. The building burned. The records closed. The town moved on. I carry the rest. I moved to the town in late September, just after the leaves had begun to turn. It was the kind of place people passed through without stopping, a narrow main street lined with low brick buildings, a hardware store, a diner, and a post office that smelled faintly of old paper and damp wood. The houses were small, set close to the road with narrow front yards, some still fenced with rusting chain link. I had rented a modest two-bedroom at the edge of town, an older frame house with peeling paint and a porch sagging in the middle. I had wanted quiet, and here it was, quiet enough that the wind moving through the trees felt loud. The first few nights were ordinary. I would fall asleep to the occasional hum of a car on the highway a mile away, the creak of the porch, or the scrape of metal siding in the breeze. The streets were empty after dark. Street lights flickered in patches, casting uneven circles of yellow across the asphalt. The only other sound was the river, half a mile beyond the last row of houses, slow and muddy, moving like it had nowhere in particular to go. It gave off a damp, earthy smell that carried into the town when the wind shifted. Then it started. At first, it was faint, distant, and I convinced myself it was the wind through the trees. A whistling, high-pitched and uneven, like someone practicing a tune on a flute that kept slipping off key. I heard it for the first time on a Thursday night. I was lying in bed, the window open to catch the cool air, and it drifted in from somewhere outside. I paused, holding my breath, listening. The whistling didn't sound musical, not really. It had gaps, a long pause, a short note, then a rising pitch that faltered at the top. It was deliberate, slow, as if someone were testing the sound, seeing how it carried in the night. I told myself it was a neighbor, someone walking home late, but the town's houses were mostly empty. Many had been for sale for years. Some nights, I didn't see a single car. I tried to ignore it, closing the window, pulling the blanket over my head. The whistling persisted, though faint and irregular, weaving through the branches and gutters outside, stopping suddenly when I strained to locate it. It seemed to vanish into the dark, only to return minutes later, closer, then farther away, unpredictable. After a week, I realized it was following a pattern. It always started just after midnight, sometimes a few minutes earlier, sometimes later. Always in the same rhythm, slow and uneven. I began to lie awake before it started, listening to the quiet of the house, the subtle groan of floorboards, the murmur of the river beyond the trees. I noticed that the air itself seemed heavier when the whistling began, like a pressure I could feel in my chest. I stopped opening the window. I walked the streets once, trying to locate the source. The night was cold, the asphalt wet from a passing drizzle. I carried a flashlight but saw nothing out of place, no figure, no movement. Every yard was still, every house dark. I walked along the riverbank, listening to the whistling echo through the trees, and it always seemed just out of reach, bouncing between the branches, disappearing when I tried to follow it. It was impossible to pinpoint. I returned home shivering, soaked, frustrated, and began sleeping with a small radio playing white noise. It helped, but only marginally. The whistling changed over time. It grew sharper, less hesitant, sometimes lingering near my house. One night, I woke to it just outside my window, high and slow, long notes stretched between brief pauses. I pressed my forehead to the glass, trying to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. The street was empty, the yard silent except for the rustle of leaves. My pulse raced. I realized then that it didn't matter whether I could see the source. The sound itself was enough to unsettle me, precise and deliberate, a human touch in the distance that made me feel exposed, watched. I began marking the nights in a notebook. I tracked the times, the intensity, the direction it seemed to move, but the pattern defied logic. Sometimes it seemed to start at the far end of the street and move toward me. Other nights, it was across the river or somewhere deeper in the trees, bouncing back and forth like a signal. I measured the notes against the wind, the moonlight, the position of streetlights. There was no connection, no environmental explanation I could discern. It was only the whistling in me, awake in the dark, tracing its path with eyes wide open. Sleep became a fragile thing. I learned to lie in the smallest patch of shadow in the room, avoiding the window, keeping my back to the door. I left small lamps on, the dim light making the dark corners less absolute. The sound would start, and I would hold my breath, listening to every shift, every rise and fall in pitch. The nearest house had been empty for years, the curtains drawn tight. The river whispered. The wind moved the branches, yet it felt like the whistling belonged to neither. I grew paranoid, aware of every shift outside, every animal sound. The cats that prowled the streets at night, the skittering raccoons, even the rustle of my own shoes on the porch. I began walking the perimeter of the house in daylight, checking locks, windows, doors. Everything was normal, pristine. Yet the whistling persisted. I realized I had started listening for it all day, waiting for the first note that would signal the return of night. One night, after weeks of it, I stayed in the kitchen, lights on, coffee in hand, listening. The sound began at exactly 12, high, deliberate. I followed it through the streetlights, past the empty houses, and then it stopped. I waited, heart racing. After a moment, I saw movement, a man, crouched at the far end of the street, whistling through a pipe between his fingers, his shadow long and distorted across the wet asphalt. He was alone. He made no effort to hide, just stood in the street, practicing, adjusting, testing the notes. I realized he had been doing this for weeks, a solitary person using the empty town as an audience. I stayed inside and watched until he walked away, slowly, methodically, fading into the darkness between houses. The next night, and every night after, he returned. I no longer feared him exactly, but the awareness of him, persistent and patient, lingered. The town itself had grown smaller in my mind, compressed to the distance between my house, the street, and the edge of the river where the whistling floated from night to night. Eventually I adjusted. I stopped leaving the window open, kept the lights low, the radio on. I learned the rhythms, the starts and stops, the breath in between. The whistling became a constant background, neither threatening nor comforting, just present. I never spoke to the man, never approached him. He didn't approach me. He existed in the spaces of the night, deliberate and unhurried, and I existed with him, aware, attentive, alive. By the time I left the town months later, the whistling was part of my memory, embedded in the rhythm of nights I spent awake, tracing sound through darkness, alert and patient. I understood then that the fear had been not of the man or the sound, but of the unknown spaces in between. The quiet streets, the river, the empty houses, the way the world seemed larger and smaller at once in the night. The whistling ended when I drove away, but it remained in my mind, precise, deliberate, a reminder of nights when the town and I were awake together, listening, waiting, alive. I went there in late summer, 2015, after my girlfriend's sister moved to a small town somewhere in the Midwest. The exact state never mattered because the landscape never changed. Flat ground, cornfields stretching in every direction, long straight roads that felt longer at night. Wind moved through the crops without stopping, a steady sound that followed you even when you were inside a car with the windows up. Her sister had joined a church that promised community healing. That was how it was described to us. Not faith, not salvation, not prayer. Community. Healing. The words sounded harmless. She had been drifting for a while after a divorce and a job loss. The church gave her something regular. A schedule. A place where people noticed when she showed up. The town itself felt tired. Gas station. Feed store. One diner with short hours. Houses built low and wide, with yards that blended into one another. People waved but did not stop. The church sat on the edge of town near an access road, a simple concrete building with a white sign and a gravel parking lot. No steeple, no stained glass. It looked more like a community center than a place of worship. The meetings happened every Tuesday night in the basement. That was where the healing work was done. We went with her sister the first time because she insisted. I did not want to go underground anywhere in a town I did not know, but I went anyway. I told myself it was polite. The basement had no windows. The stairs were narrow and painted beige. The paint was peeling where hands had brushed the walls over years. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air was cooler than upstairs, heavy with moisture. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, close enough that knees almost touched. The floor was bare concrete with dark patches that never fully dried. There was no prayer, no hymns, no scripture. People sat and waited until everyone was present. Then they took turns sharing burdens. That was the word used. Burdens. Each person spoke about something they had lost. Jobs, marriages, children who moved away and stopped calling, illnesses that never fully healed. The tone was flat. No crying, no comfort, just listing facts. I noticed that no one asked questions. No one offered advice. The room absorbed the words and moved on. I also noticed the smell. It hit me every time I went down the stairs. Damp concrete mixed with something sweet and spoiled. It reminded me of old fruit left too long in a warm room. It clung to clothes and hair. It never faded while we were down there. After a few weeks, I started to recognize faces that did not come back upstairs afterward. At first I assumed they left early or had another exit. Then I realized I never saw them again at all. Their chairs stayed empty. The circle adjusted. The pastor explained their absence by saying they were resting. That was the explanation offered. Resting after releasing what they carried. The upstairs part of the church stayed normal. Coffee in large metal containers. Flyers on a bulletin board. A bathroom that smelled of disinfectant. No one mentioned the people who stopped coming upstairs. No missing posters. No police presence. The town moved the same way it always had. My girlfriend started to look uncomfortable during the meetings. Her sister looked calmer, lighter. She spoke less at home and spent more time at the church. She said she felt closer to the people there than she ever had anywhere else. She slept better on Tuesdays. I started paying attention to details. The way the basement door locked automatically when it closed. The way the pastor kept his keys on a lanyard and never set them down. The way the smell seemed strongest near the far wall behind a row of old storage cabinets. One afternoon when the building was empty, I went back alone. The parking lot was clear. The doors were unlocked. I walked downstairs and stood in the quiet. Without people, the basement felt smaller. The lights flickered. The smell lingered. I moved the cabinets along the far wall. They were lighter than they looked. Behind them was a section of wall that sounded hollow when I knocked. A false panel held in place with screws painted over many times. I removed it with a screwdriver I found in a utility closet. The second room was narrow and deeper than the basement itself. The air was stale and warmer. Shelving lined the walls from floor to ceiling. On the shelves were personal items. Shoes arranged in pairs. Wallets stacked and labeled. Phones wrapped in plastic bags. Keys. Watches. Everything clean. Everything tagged with names and dates. There was a drain in the floor. It was stained dark around the edges. The sweet smell was stronger there. It made my eyes water. I left the room as it was and replaced the panel. I did not take anything. I did not call anyone. I went upstairs and locked the door behind me. That night I could not sleep. I listened to the wind moving through the corn. I thought about the people who shared their burdens and never came back upstairs. I thought about resting as a final state. We left town 2 days later. I packed the car while my girlfriend tried one last time to convince her sister to come with us. She refused. She said she had finally been emptied. She said there was nothing left that needed to leave town. We drove away without her. The road stretched straight ahead. The corn closed in on both sides. The church disappeared behind us without ceremony. 6 months later, I looked up the town online. The church had closed. There was a brief notice in a regional paper about a zoning violation and a change in ownership. No mention of an investigation. No names listed. The building is still there. I know because I drove past it once on a work trip. The sign is gone. The windows upstairs are dark. The parking lot is always full on Tuesdays. Cars line the gravel shoulder and spill onto the access road. People go inside and do not stay long. I did not stop. I did not look back. I kept driving until the wind sound faded and the road curved for the first time in hours. I moved to the town in the late summer, seeking quiet after years of commuting and constant noise. It was small, so small that most maps barely showed it. The streets ended abruptly in fields and woods, and the people kept to themselves, going about their routines without much notice of anyone new. I rented a cabin at the very edge of town, where the dirt road narrowed and disappeared into the trees. The cabin had been empty for years, according to the real estate agent, and it showed. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging slightly, and the porch slats creaked under the weight of the wind. It wasn't a beautiful place. It wasn't meant to be. It was quiet, isolated, and close to the woods, and that was exactly what I needed. The first walk around the property made me realize how neglected it had been. The yard was overgrown with grass taller than my knees, dotted with small patches of wildflowers that had managed to survive. Fallen branches littered the path to the front door. I noticed the windows were coated with a thin layer of dirt, the kind that comes from years of rain running down the glass. The front door's paint was peeling, but the lock still worked. Inside, the air smelled of dust, wood, and the faint sourness of something long closed in. The floors were wooden, uneven in places, and the corners were dark with accumulated dirt. Every surface had a thin film of dust that coated my fingers when I touched it. The kitchen cupboards had once been painted cream, but the paint had cracked and faded to an off-white, and the handles were tarnished. There were no appliances except for an old stove, its enamel chipped and dull. The bathroom was functional, if minimal, with a cracked sink and a bathtub that had taken on a yellowed patina over time. The woods behind the cabin were thick, a mix of pine and oak, with underbrush that grew densely in places. I could hear the river in the distance, a slow, low murmur that seemed constant once I noticed it. In the late afternoon, the sun would filter through the trees, casting long shadows over the yard and giving the forest a dark, almost bluish tint. At first, the isolation was soothing. The town felt small and contained, almost invisible beyond the edges of its main street. I could go days without seeing anyone. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, another cabin set back from the road and mostly hidden by trees. I began to notice small things after a week. Footprints in the yard that I didn't recognize, depressions in the grass that weren't there before. The first time I noticed them, I assumed I had imagined it or misremembered where I had walked. Then I saw the marks on the porch railing, faint scratches, too deliberate to be the work of a tree branch. They were small, thin, shallow, but they formed a pattern that felt intentional. I checked the windows at night, sometimes leaving lights on to see shadows, but I never saw anyone. The creaking came next. Not the floorboards, not the wind. The ceiling, the walls. Subtle shifts, slow groans of the cabin settling. At first, I dismissed it, but it began to follow a rhythm. A weight that moved above me along the attic beams. I had checked the attic earlier. The panel in the ceiling was nailed shut, the wood warped with age. No way in, no way out, and nothing up there except cobwebs and dust. Sleep became difficult. I would lie awake, hearing footsteps across the porch at night. Sometimes they were soft, almost hesitant, and sometimes heavier, deliberate, like someone testing the boards. When I looked through the windows, the woods were empty. I started leaving doors locked at all times, even though the lock had always been secure. I noticed my supplies rearranged slightly in the mornings. Cans of food that I was sure I had stacked in one order were slightly shifted. A small bag moved to a corner. I didn't leave the cabin unlocked. There was no explanation for it, and I began to feel watched. One evening, I decided to walk the edge of the property along the treeline. The forest felt different up close, oppressive and dense, the ground soft with fallen needles and wet leaves. I noticed subtle paths that had formed between the trees, narrow, faint trails that didn't connect to any road. They weren't animal trails. The spacing and the depressions suggested a human had walked them repeatedly. I followed one for a few minutes until it curved out of sight, then returned to the cabin. The thought of someone having been there while I slept, moving around without leaving more obvious traces, unsettled me. I started documenting the changes, taking notes of the scratches, the marks, the shifted items. It became a pattern. Each night, I would hear the cabin move, creak, or settle in a way that matched the next morning's evidence. Footsteps, depressions, scratches, rearranged objects. I began to install simple cameras near the porch and inside, but the images revealed nothing. The footage showed me alone, the cabin empty. Yet every morning there were new disturbances. One afternoon, I went through the attic panel again, pressing my hands against the old wood. The nails were rusted, the wood brittle. I lifted it slightly, enough to peek inside. It was empty, dark, dusty. I ran a flashlight across the beams and corners. No footprints, no signs of recent presence, nothing. And yet, the noises continued. I realized the cabin itself had become a kind of instrument, responding to weight, vibration, and temperature. The old wood, the sagging floors, the warped beams, they all made sounds that were amplified by the design of the house. A step in the hallway could reverberate into a creak that sounded like someone pacing in the attic. The shifting boards of the porch could mimic the sound of someone standing and moving. I was imagining patterns, connecting coincidences into something intentional. It took weeks, but slowly I understood the truth. There was no one. The cabin was old, neglected, imperfect. The floors creaked because the beams were uneven. The roof shifted under the wind. The porch boards warped with temperature and moisture. Objects seemed to move because I had bumped them, or they slid slowly under gravity on uneven surfaces. The scratches were from a branch brushing against the railing in storms, or from rodents gnawing the wood. I had begun to overlay human intent on purely natural processes, giving life to a house that had been abandoned for decades. Accepting this brought relief, though it did not erase the tension entirely. The cabin was still old, still creaked and groaned, and I remained cautious. I repaired the floors, sealed the cracks, reinforced the doors, and cleaned thoroughly. I no longer looked for patterns in every sound. Instead, I listened without assuming, noting the wind, the rain, and the natural settling of the building. I began to walk the woods deliberately, noting the real animal tracks, the clearings, and the natural paths without expecting them to be something more. The weight above the ceiling was gone, not because it had never existed, but because I no longer projected fear onto it. By the end of my stay, I had come to understand the cabin as it was, not as I had imagined it. It was old, quiet, and isolated. Its sounds were subtle, its changes slow, and its presence imposing, but entirely ordinary. The town itself seemed protective in its own way. I left the cabin one crisp morning, closing the door behind me carefully, aware that it would settle, creak, and shift long after I was gone. The woods would reclaim some of the yard, the floors would groan under weather, and the porch would continue to bend in the wind. I drove away slowly, taking one last look at the gray wood, the sagging roof, the trees bending around it. It had been unnerving, tense, even terrifying in its own subtle way, but it had never been anything more than what it was. And for the first time in years, I felt a quiet satisfaction in having seen it clearly, without imagination filling the corners of shadows. I went there after the layoff because I needed somewhere cheap and quiet, and because my brother said the cold air and lack of noise would fix my sleep. I believed him because I needed to believe something. It was late spring of 2009. The snow had pulled back into the trees, but the ground still held water. The town did not have a sign. The highway bent and narrowed, and there it was, a cluster of buildings pressed between swamp and pine. There was no grocery store, no motel, no school that I could see. A gas station with 2 pumps that looked older than me. A diner with a flat roof and 1 window facing the road. A post office that only opened 3 days a week according to a faded notice taped inside the glass. Everything else was houses set far back from the road, most of them single-story, most of them with gravel driveways that had sunk into the mud. The air smelled like wet needles and fuel. The silence was heavy. It was not the peaceful kind. It felt watched. Cars passed through without slowing much, because there was no reason to stop unless you lived there. The first time one drove by while I was unloading my boxes, every person in sight paused. A man leaning on the gas station wall stopped mid-shift. A woman coming out of the diner froze with her hand on the door. Heads turned together. No one looked at the driver. Every pair of eyes tracked the car itself as it moved down the road and disappeared. I told myself it was curiosity. A stranger was rare. I had not lived anywhere this small before. Still, it happened again and again. Every passing vehicle drew the same response. Work stopped. Hands went still. Eyes followed the metal shape until it was gone. Then life resumed like a switch had been flipped back on. I rented a small house at the edge of town where the pavement ended and the dirt began. The landlord lived 2 miles away and dropped the key through the mail slot. The house smelled of old water and dust. The floors sloped toward the center. The windows faced the road. I did not like that, so I kept the blinds low. The first morning I walked to the diner because there was nowhere else to eat. Inside it was clean but worn. Vinyl booths cracked at the seams. A calendar from a feed company hung behind the counter. Before anything else happened, the waitress wanted to know how long I planned to stay. I said a month or 2, because that was what I had told myself. She wrote something on the receipt before she wrote down food. I noticed because it was a straight line and then another line next to it. I told myself it was a note about a tab. People watched me while I ate. Not openly. They looked down when I looked up. Their eyes tracked the road through the window whenever a car passed. I heard forks stop moving. I felt the pause like pressure in my ears. Every evening around the same time, just before the sun dropped behind the trees, 3 pickup trucks drove a slow loop through town. They were different colors but the same shape. Old. Clean. No rust. The beds were always empty. The headlights were on even in full daylight. They moved at the same speed and kept the same distance between them. They did not turn down side roads. They made a circle and returned the way they came. I watched from my porch the first time and felt foolish for counting. After a week I could not help it. I knew the sound of each engine. I knew the order. The gas station was the only place to buy anything beyond a meal. I went there every few days for milk and coffee. One morning I heard the owner arguing with someone in the back room. I did not hear words clearly. I caught fragments. Something about numbers being off again. Something about fixing it before night. The door closed. When he came back out, his hands shook as he rang me up. He did not look at me. He watched the road. That night I found chalk marks on my driveway. They were near the edge where the gravel met the dirt. White lines in groups of 5. Clean strokes. Not random. Tally marks. I wiped them away with my shoe and checked the rest of the yard. There were no footprints that I could see. The ground was soft enough that there should have been. After that I started paying attention to smaller things. The post office log book on the counter had columns filled with dates and numbers, but no names. The diner receipts always had extra marks. The trucks sometimes stopped near my house before completing their loop. Never long. Long enough for the engines to idle. Long enough for me to notice. I slept poorly. The silence pressed in at night, and every sound felt close. I began to understand why people paused when a car came through. It broke the quiet like a crack in glass. It announced something. It changed the count. I drove out of town twice just to feel motion. Each time one of the trucks appeared behind me on the highway until I reached the county line. It turned around at the same spot both times. The second time I slowed to see if it would pass. It did not. I tried to make sense of it without reaching for fear. I told myself the town tracked traffic for funding. I told myself the loops were a volunteer patrol. I told myself the chalk was from kids, though I never saw any children. I never saw a school bus. I never saw a playground. One afternoon, I went to the post office on a day it was open. There was a bulletin board with notices pinned in careful rows. Lost dogs, church dinners, a list of names under a heading that suggested departures. The dates stretched back years. 14 names over 10 years. No addresses, no destinations, just dates. I stood there longer than I meant to. No one asked if I needed help. That evening the trucks came earlier. The sun was still high. They slowed more than usual when they passed my house. I did not go outside. I packed a bag instead. I told myself I would leave in the morning. I did not sleep. Just before dawn I found new chalk marks where I had erased the old ones. One more line added. I felt a calm settle in that scared me more than panic would have. I understood then in a simple way. The town counted cars because cars meant people. People were the variable they needed to control. I left as soon as it was light enough to see the road. I did not stop at the diner. I did not go to the gas station. I drove straight through. One of the trucks pulled out behind me near the edge of town. It followed at a distance that never changed. I watched the trees thin and the marsh give way to fields. At the county line it slowed and turned back without hesitation. It did not cross. I did not stop until I reached a larger town with a grocery store and a motel. I stayed there for a week. I slept with the lights on. I read local papers and state reports. I found a small article about a town losing population without records. 14 people over 10 years. No missing reports because there were no complaints. Everyone had said they were leaving. No one had said where. I understood then how it worked. The town needed a stable number to keep its services funded and its routines intact. Too many people strained it. Too few threatened it. Cars were the signal. Outsiders were risk. They watched. They counted. They marked. When the numbers went off, they corrected them by making sure someone left early. Quietly. Cleanly. No reports because there was nothing to report. I never went back. I warned my brother without details. I still check my mirrors on empty roads. When a car passes and I feel that pause inside myself, I keep driving. I moved to the desert Southwest in the spring of 2018, seeking distance. After my divorce, the quiet anonymity of small towns appealed to me. I wanted a place where nobody knew my name, where the divorce papers and the lingering sense of failure could remain my own. The town I found was barely on a map. There was one road in and one road out, a strip of asphalt that twisted between red rock mesas and low desert scrub. The air carried a dry heat even in the early morning, and dust swirled constantly along the shoulders, pushed by a wind that seemed determined to reach every crevice of the landscape. The town was a line of low buildings that could have been lifted from any other desert highway. A gas station, a diner, a hardware store, and a small post office with peeling white paint. Beyond that, the land opened to a pale, barren horizon. I rented a small house on the edge of town, a single-story place with pale stucco walls and a flat roof. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the kind of smell that clung to the air conditioning ducts. The floors were concrete, and the windows faced the highway, offering a clear view of the line of mailboxes that stretched like bones along the shoulder of the road. Mine was number 14, a standard green metal box with a red flag. It was unremarkable, yet it would come to define the strange rhythm of my time there. The first few weeks were quiet. I settled into routines, early morning runs along the highway, long walks in the heat, and evenings sitting on the porch with a glass of water or a beer, watching the sunlight fade over the mesas. Mail came once a day around mid-morning. At first, I thought the occasional bent envelope or loose paper was just carelessness. But soon I noticed that every piece of mail I received had already been opened. The flaps were torn neatly, nothing ripped or crumpled, and the contents were always intact. I asked the postmaster about it during one of my visits to the office, a small square building with a single counter and a fan that rattled on the ceiling. He blamed the wind, said the desert gusts could be strong enough to pull envelopes open as they passed through the sorting machinery. I nodded, accepted the explanation, but the feeling in my stomach didn't settle. I became aware of a pattern. People avoided mailbox 14. When anyone walked along the highway, they would step over it as if it didn't exist. Kids on bikes swerved wide to keep their distance. Delivery drivers slowed, glanced at the box, and continued without stopping, even when they had packages that should have gone there. I assumed it was superstition at first, some small-town habit or private joke. The more I watched, the the more I realized it was deliberate. Nobody came near it, and the avoidance was consistent. Even the postman, a man I later learned had been in town for decades, seemed to hesitate each time he approached it, pausing longer than necessary, glancing toward the house. The first letter that unsettled me arrived on a Wednesday morning. The envelope was heavier than usual, unmarked except for my name in neat, precise handwriting. I recognized it immediately as mine. I had not written it, and no one in town knew I had moved in. I brought it inside and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, with a description of my house that was impossibly accurate. It detailed the layout of the rooms, the color of the walls, even the small chip in the plaster near the kitchen window. It mentioned a cracked floor tile in the bathroom, one I hadn't noticed yet. I double-checked, and there it was, exactly as described. My pulse accelerated, but I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps someone had watched the house, noted details, and sent it as a prank. But the handwriting was too exact, the knowledge too precise. There was no one I knew, and no way anyone could have obtained that information without being inside. After that, the letters became a pattern. I would check the mailbox each morning and find a single envelope, always addressed to me, always describing something about the house or my day that had not yet occurred. A window left open, a broken branch on the porch, a light fixture that flickered at night. I stopped going for walks near the box, choosing instead the dirt paths behind the house where the desert was open and no one was watching. I became hyper-aware of the highway, the empty cars that passed, the long shadows of the mesas in the afternoon sun. Every rustle in the brush or scrape of gravel against asphalt set my heart racing. I tried to explain it to myself logically. Perhaps the town had a system for newcomers, a way to observe them until they felt fully settled. Perhaps the letters were from a neighbor with too much time, someone who found satisfaction in knowing every detail of my life. I even considered the possibility of a scam, though I had no money or valuables of note. Still, the accuracy of the descriptions made it impossible to ignore. The house was described in advance, the letters always arriving before the events occurred. If a chair shifted while I was cleaning, the letter would arrive the next day, describing it in detail. I began documenting the letters, stacking them in a box under the bed. Each one was more precise than the last. One mentioned a small crack that had appeared in the kitchen counter overnight. Another noted a dusty footprint near the bedroom door that I hadn't yet cleaned. I kept thinking about the people in town, the way they avoided the mailbox. It was as if they knew something I didn't. The postmaster's casual shrug when I asked about the open mail now seemed deliberate, a warning couched in friendliness. As the months passed, the isolation became heavier. The desert sun burned through the windows even with the blinds drawn, and the wind made the mailbox flag flap in a rhythm that was too deliberate to ignore. I stopped leaving the house unless necessary, stopping only when I could see the horizon and the line of red rock ahead. I started to keep my doors locked, even during the day, and I installed an inexpensive security camera that pointed at the mailbox. The footage was unremarkable, the postman, the occasional delivery driver, nothing more. Yet the letters continued to arrive, sometimes describing moments I had not even experienced yet. It was as if someone was following my life in real time, noting every detail before it happened. The culmination came one hot afternoon in late September. I was in the living room, the sun slicing through the blinds, casting long rectangles of light across the floor. The mailbox flag had been raised all morning, signaling the arrival of mail. I approached cautiously, opened the box, and found a single envelope. This time it was different. The envelope contained a letter typed in the same precise style, but the content was concise, chilling in its simplicity. It described the house as empty, the furniture gone, the blinds closed. It mentioned me leaving, walking down the highway with my suitcase, and the mailbox standing empty behind me. I checked the window. My car was still in the driveway. The house was as it always had been. My hands shook as I held the paper, the finality of the words pressing against my chest. Whoever was responsible knew I had been planning to leave. They had observed, waited, and recorded. I left the next morning. I packed my car slowly, making sure to leave nothing behind that might have been overlooked. I did not glance at the mailbox as I drove away. The road stretched straight into the desert, the wind flaring dust into the air. I felt the presence of the town even as I left, a weight in the air that followed me until the horizon swallowed the buildings. I did not return. I drove for hours, then days, until the land opened into highways and towns that felt normal, where mailboxes were ordinary and anonymous. I rented a place far from the desert and lived quietly for months. I tried to forget the heat, the wind, the strange precision of the letters, the way the mailbox had watched me, a silent sentinel on the side of the road. A week after I settled in a small city far from the desert, I received one last letter. The return address was the town. The envelope was thin, the paper familiar. I opened it with a careful hand, expecting the usual descriptions, the meticulous detail. Instead, the letter contained 4 simple words, typed clearly without flourish. Good. Now it's empty again. My stomach dropped. It was the confirmation that my departure had been observed, recorded, and acknowledged. Whoever, or whatever, had monitored Mailbox 14 had waited for me to leave, and now the cycle could begin again. I filed the letter away, but it never felt safe. Every mailbox I passed afterward felt slightly suspicious, every quiet town slightly watchful. I never returned to that desert road, never considered the small house or the line of green mailboxes. Mailbox 14 remained in my memory, a fixed point of precision and quiet observation, a reminder that some places exist outside the ordinary rules, where even the simplest objects can carry an awareness that is both real and unavoidable. The town faded from sight, but the memory did not. I carry it with me still. The mailbox is gone from my life, yet its shadow lingers. The knowledge that someone had tracked every detail of my life, that my movements, my home, and my absence had been noted, was not comforting, and it never will be. I do not know who sent the letters or why they chose me, and the town's silence remains intact. But I know the truth of the observation. I know that Mailbox 14, standing alone along a lonely highway, held a presence that was methodical, patient, and utterly human. It was the people who lived there, the town itself, who carried the intent, and that knowledge is more terrifying than any unexplained phenomenon. My time there ended, but the certainty of it remains, a fixed mark in the landscape of my memory, unshakable and complete. I have no desire to return. No curiosity lingers. The town, the mailbox, the letters, those were the only things that mattered in that place, and now they are someone else's problem. The emptiness they described that day was not just physical. It was final. I am gone, and Mailbox 14 stands alone once more.